On February 13, 1258, the Mongol army of Hulagu Khan entered Baghdad. What happened over the next 7 days is one of the most documented and least understood events in the history of human knowledge. The city had been the intellectual capital of the world for 400 years. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, had accumulated manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, Greek, Syriac, Sanskrit, and Coptic. Translations of Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, Galen, Ptolemy, made by scholars who were paid their weight in gold for each completed text. Original works in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy produced over 4 centuries of the Islamic Golden Age. The chroniclers who survived described what happened to those manuscripts. So many books were thrown into the Tigris River, they wrote, that the water ran black with ink. So many books were thrown into the river that they formed a bridge a man on horseback could cross. Those are the images that history gave us. A river black with ink, a bridge made of books. But here is the question that those images prevent us from asking. How many manuscripts survived? Not 0, we know that. The astronomer and philosopher Nasir al-Din al-Tusi removed approximately 400,000 manuscripts from Baghdad before the siege, carrying them to the observatory at Maraga in northwestern Iran. Some collections were hidden. Some scholars fled with what they could carry. Some texts had already been copied and distributed to libraries in Cairo, Cordoba, and Samarkand. But here is what we cannot answer. We do not know what was in the House of Wisdom when Hulagu's army arrived. No complete catalogue survives, no inventory, no list of what was there to be lost. Which means we cannot calculate what was destroyed. We can describe the destruction, we cannot measure it. And an unmeasured loss is the most dangerous kind, because it leaves open the possibility that we are missing something we do not know we are missing. The river ran black with ink. We have been looking at the color of the water ever since, and not asking what the ink was made of.
Here is what the history books tell us. The House of Wisdom was the greatest library of the medieval world. Founded under Caliph al-Mansur in the 8th century, expanded under Harun al-Rashid, and brought to its peak under al-Mamun in the 9th century, it was the center of the translation movement, the systematic effort to render the entire intellectual heritage of Greece, Persia, and India into Arabic. For 4 centuries, Baghdad was where the world's knowledge lived. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked together in its halls. The Caliph al-Mamun paid translators the weight of their completed manuscripts in gold. The mathematician al-Khwarizmi developed algebra there. The physician al-Razi wrote his comprehensive medical encyclopedia there. The philosopher al-Kindi synthesized Aristotle with Islamic thought there. Then the Mongols came, and it ended. The textbooks present 1258 as a clean rupture, the Islamic Golden Age, which had lasted 5 centuries, terminating in a single week of violence. The river ran black, the books were gone, the light went out. That is the story. It is not wrong, but it has a hidden assumption inside it. The assumption is that we know what was there. Modern scholarship has quietly begun to question the scale of the institution itself. The historian Dmitry Gutas, in his foundational study of the translation movement, argues that the House of Wisdom may not have been the vast formal institution of popular imagination.
It may have been primarily a library and translation bureau. Important, certainly, but not the Hogwarts-scale academy of scholarship that later narratives constructed. The Encyclopaedia Britannica notes that after the Abbasid capital moved from Baghdad to Samarra in 836, the library that the Mongols destroyed in 1258 may have been considerably diminished from its peak 4 centuries earlier. Which raises a different kind of question. If we have been measuring the wrong loss, if the destruction of 1258 was catastrophic but not quite as total as the river black with ink image suggests, then what exactly ended in 1258? Not the knowledge. Much of the knowledge had been translated, copied, distributed, survived. What ended in 1258 was the institution, the place, the continuity, the community of scholars who knew what was there, who maintained the catalogue, who understood the connections between texts that no single document recorded. The loss was not only the manuscripts, it was the people who knew how to read them in relation to each other. That is a different kind of loss, and it is much harder to measure. To understand what was lost in 1258, you have to understand what the translation movement actually produced. Between roughly 750 and 950 AD, 2 centuries of systematic intellectual work, the scholars of Baghdad translated into Arabic virtually everything that had survived from the Greek scientific and philosophical tradition. Aristotle's complete works, Euclid's Elements, Archimedes on mechanics and hydrostatics, Ptolemy's Algemist, Galen's medical corpus, Diophantus on algebra. But they did not merely translate, they annotated, they corrected, they extended. They identified errors in the Greek originals and proposed solutions. They built on what they received. Al-Khwarizmi did not just translate mathematics. He invented a new kind of mathematics, what we now call algebra from the Arabic al-Jabr, that the Greek tradition had not contained. Ibn al-Haytham did not just translate optics, he conducted experiments. He built the first documented camera obscura. He wrote the Book of Optics, the most sophisticated analysis of light and vision produced anywhere in the world before the 17th century. Al-Biruni did not just translate astronomy, he calculated the circumference of the Earth to within less than 1% of its actual value, using a method of his own devising in the early 11th century. This body of work, the translations plus the original scholarship built on top of them, was distributed across multiple institutions. The House of Wisdom was the center, but not the only repository. Libraries in Cairo, Cordoba, Nishapur, Bukhara, and Samarkand all held copies of major works. The question of what 1258 destroyed is therefore not a simple question of how many manuscripts were in one building. It is a question of what was unique. We can track some of this. We know that certain texts were never seen in Europe or the Islamic world after 1258 that had been referenced in earlier scholarship. We know that certain astronomical tables, certain mathematical commentaries, certain medical observations documented before 1258 simply do not appear in the subsequent tradition. But we cannot make a complete accounting, because to make a complete accounting, you need a catalogue of what existed, and the catalogue was in the building that burned. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi saved approximately 400,000 manuscripts by removing them to Maraghe before the siege. 400,000. That is an extraordinary rescue. It is also a number that tells us almost nothing about what was not rescued, because we do not know the total. The silence of 1258 is not just the silence of destroyed manuscripts. It is the silence of the catalogue that would have told us what to mourn. We are mourning without a list of the dead, and a grief without a list has a particular quality. It stays permanently open. It cannot resolve. Because there is always the possibility that something we are missing, some connection we cannot make, some problem we cannot solve, has its answer in a text that was in Baghdad in February 1258 and was not among the manuscripts Nasir al-Din Tusi had time to carry away. That is not a metaphor. That is a technical description of an epistemological condition, a gap in the knowledge base of human civilization that we cannot measure because the instrument of measurement was itself destroyed.
1258 was not the only silence. The destruction of the House of Wisdom is the most documented single event in the history of lost knowledge, but it was part of a pattern of institutional destruction that spans the entire history of human civilization and that has a consistent mechanism. The Library of Alexandria did not burn in a single fire. That is a myth, a dramatic image that compresses several centuries of institutional decline into a single catastrophic moment. The reality was more mundane and more complete. The library declined over centuries through neglect, underfunding, and the gradual dispersal of its scholars to other institutions. By the time the Arab conquest of Egypt arrived in 641 AD, there is genuine scholarly debate about whether a significant collection remained. The Maya codices, the books of the Maya civilization, were systematically burned by the Spanish bishop Diego de Nalanda in 1562 in a single documented act of deliberate destruction. Of an estimated thousands of codices, 4 survived. We know the Maya had sophisticated astronomical systems, complex calendrical calculations, and a written historical tradition. We know this from what those 4 books contain and from what Spanish observers described before the burning. We cannot reconstruct what was in the books that burned. The Library of Antioch, destroyed by the Emperor Jovian in 364 AD. The Library of Ctesiphon, destroyed when the Arab armies took the Sassanid capital. The Library of the Aztec ruler Nezahualcóyotl, destroyed by Cortés. The Buddhist libraries of Nalanda University in India, burned by Muhammad Bakhtiar Khilji in 1193, 65 years before Baghdad, the same Mongol-era period of displacement, a different army, the same mechanism of institutional destruction. The pattern is this: a center of knowledge accumulation, a library, a university, an observatory, a scriptorium, exists in a political structure. The political structure is destroyed. The knowledge center, which depended on the political structure for its maintenance and its catalogue and its community of readers, does not survive the political destruction, even if some of its manuscripts do. The manuscripts that survive become orphaned texts. They exist without the institutional context that gave them meaning, without the scholars who knew how they connected to each other, without the catalogue that told you what questions they answered, without the tradition of commentary that showed you how to read them. An orphaned text is not the same as a living text. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi saved 400,000 manuscripts, but he could not save the community of scholars who had spent their lives understanding the relationships between those manuscripts. He saved the books, he could not save the library. That distinction between the survival of texts and the survival of the institution that gave those texts their meaning is the pattern that repeats across every major destruction of human knowledge. The silence of 1258 was not unique. It was one instance of a recurring mechanism by which civilizations lose not just their books, but their ability to read them. The mechanism of the 1258 erasure operated in 3 stages. The first stage was physical, the destruction of the manuscripts themselves, books thrown into the Tigris, books burned, books torn apart for their leather covers, which could be made into sandals. The physical objects of knowledge treated as raw material by an army that had no use for their contents. But the second stage was more consequential. The scholars died. The House of Wisdom was not just a building full of manuscripts, it was a community of practice, a network of people who had spent decades learning Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Syriac, who had developed methods of translation and annotation, who carried in their minds connections between texts that were never written down in any single place. When the Mongols killed the scholars of Baghdad, and they killed the scholars alongside everyone else, the intellectual class receiving no special protection, they destroyed something that the manuscripts alone could not preserve. They destroyed the reading practice. The surviving texts from the Islamic Golden Age that we can still access today through libraries in Istanbul, Cairo, Tehran, and the Vatican are frequently accompanied by the comment that their full meaning is partially obscure. Not because the language is lost, because the context in which those texts were read, the questions they were answering, the debates they were participating in, that context was carried in the minds of the scholars who died in Baghdad in February 1258. The third stage of erasure was cartographic. The reorganization of the intellectual world after 1258 around different centers. Cairo became the new capital of Islamic learning. The Mamluk sultans supported scholarship. Scholars fled from Baghdad and brought what they had saved. But Cairo was not Baghdad. The translation movement was not reconstructed. The systematic effort to accumulate and extend the entire Greek and Persian scientific inheritance did not resume. What resumed was commentary. What resumed was consolidation of what had survived. What did not resume was the original research program, the active extension of the knowledge base that al-Khwarizmi and Ibn al-Haytham and al-Biruni had been conducting. The silence of 1258 was not total. Scholarship continued. Books were written. Observations were made. But the specific intellectual trajectory that had been running for 5 centuries in Baghdad, the program of systematically interrogating and extending the entire inheritance of human knowledge, that trajectory was interrupted. Whether it would have continued regardless of 1258 is a question historians debate. The political decline of the Abbasid Caliphate had been underway for a century before Hulagu arrived. The intellectual Golden Age may have been already past its peak. But here is what we cannot know. We cannot know what Ibn al-Haytham's successors would have done with his optics. We cannot know what the mathematicians working in the tradition of al-Khwarizmi would have discovered next. We cannot know which problems were on the desks of the scholars who died in the week of February 1258. The silence of 1258 is the silence of work that was never finished. And work that was never finished leaves no record of where it was going.
In 1977, a manuscript was found in a library in Istanbul. It was a copy of a text by the 10th century mathematician Abu Bakr al-Karaji, a work on algebra that had been unknown to modern scholarship. It extended the methods of al-Khwarizmi in directions that modern mathematicians recognized as anticipating techniques not rediscovered in Europe until the 16th and 17th centuries. The manuscript had been in Istanbul for centuries. It was simply not catalogued in a way that made it findable. This happens regularly. Every decade, manuscripts appear in collections in Istanbul, Cairo, Tehran, and Tashkent that were copied from Baghdad originals, carried out of the city before or during the siege, and deposited in libraries where they waited for centuries for someone to understand what they were. This means that the silence of 1258 is not fixed. It is partially recoverable. Slowly, manuscript by manuscript, the catalogue of what survived is being reconstructed. Digital scanning projects at major Islamic manuscript libraries are making texts accessible that have not been read by scholars in 5 centuries. Some of what we thought was lost may not be, but some of it certainly is gone. And here is what makes 1258 different from other historical losses. We know approximately when European science made the major theoretical advances of the scientific revolution: Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Leibniz, in the 16th and 17th centuries. We know that many of these advances were built on Latin translations of Arabic texts that were themselves translations and extensions of Greek originals. What we do not know is whether those advances were discoveries, genuinely new knowledge, or rediscoveries of work that had already been done in Baghdad and was lost in 1258. Ibn al-Haytham described the principles of the camera obscura in the 11th century. European scholars described them again in the 16th century. Was the second description independent, or did it follow through an indirect chain of transmission from the first? We cannot fully answer that question, because the catalogue of what was in Baghdad in 1258 does not exist. Nasir al-Tusi stands at the edge of the besieged city, his carts loaded with 400,000 manuscripts. He could not carry the catalogue. He left what he could reach, he left behind what he could not. And what he left behind has been silent for 767 years. We do not know its name, we do not know its subject, we do not know the question it was answering. We know only that the river ran black with ink, and that black is the color of everything we cannot read.